Hello, everyone. This is number 22 of my ongoing series on YouTube dealing with interpretations of Bible prophecy through the ages. I want to remind everyone that I'm surveying interpretations, ideas that people have had, both Christians and Jews, through history as to what these prophecies might mean. In other words, eschatology, apocalypticism, the end of the age, the world to come. There are different ways of talking about end times prophecies. And that's what I'm doing in this series. Now, I'm calling this one Putting It All Together, even though I have a couple more video episodes in mind in the series. So I'm going to share my screen and get right into it here. So I've titled this first slide, 21st Century End Time Prophetic Scenarios, What and When. And here you have this wonderful fisheye view of Jerusalem, formed probably from Google Maps, and I just love it. Coming down on the most important real estate on the planet in terms of Bible prophecy. This is where Jews, Christians, and Muslims all come together with some degree of difference in interpretation, to say the least. And in fact, I'm making this in November of 2023. Hamas called the war that broke out on October 7th the Al-Aqsa flood or the Al-Aqsa wave, because they refer to this mosque right here as the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And they're trying to whip up fervor against the Jews as if the Jews are going to take this over and destroy the mosque, and therefore Islam will be threatened. I'm not going to go into Islamic views of Jerusalem at this point. It's a controversial thing. I could say a lot about it, but I don't want to detract from the main point that I'm making here. And I'm going to deal primarily with Christian views because those are frankly the main ones that you hear. There are Jewish interpretations of Bible prophecy, of the Hebrew Bible, of course, but it's the Christian interpretations that really have the airwaves, that are really out there, that are on YouTube and on television and radio and in the pulpits of the land, particularly in the United States of America, but elsewhere as well. So here we have the axis mundi, the axis of the earth, with Jerusalem as the center, this wonderful ancient map. And indeed, if you take the continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa like a pinwheel and put the pen in the middle of Jerusalem, you can kind of spin this thing around. So my teacher, Jonathan Smith at the University of Chicago, wrote a book called Map is Not Territory, one of the greatest titles of a book that I've ever known. And he's trying to make the point, it's a collection of his essays. Don't think a map is a map. A map is a concept. So here we have the concept of Jerusalem being the center of the world and certainly the focus of so much of Western history. So remember that lecture I just mentioned, when Jerusalem means Jerusalem. Now, there's not in heaven, but actually the city of Jerusalem. And if armies attack Jerusalem, it's understood by hundreds of millions of people to mean Jerusalem, not some symbolic use of the term. And I've talked about that in a number of these lectures. So here are our key biblical texts, and that's why I'm calling this Putting This All Together. When I was doing the book of Revelation, particularly the previous episode, number 21, I kept making the point that what the book of Revelation is really doing, particularly in its original form before it was Christianized. And again, I'm not objecting to its Christianization. I'm just suggesting that there's an earlier Jewish foundation that has nothing to do with the Jesus movement, but it's every bit as biblical as any other apocalypse that we have. And I think it's important to recover that and to see it. And then you can see what's really happening with what you could call the base text. And then the base text can get overwritten and rewritten as it applies to Christians. Frankly, a Jewish believer today in another Messiah could come around and take this text and rewrite it or overlay it with an interpretation of a different Messiah coming in the clouds of heaven. But here are the main texts that the book of Revelation builds upon. First of all, the Isaiah apocalypse. This is so important. It's overlooked too many times. These chapters of Isaiah 24, 25, 26, and 27, they don't seem to fit into the first part of Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39. And they stand out as a kind of an apocalypse. And if you read them, they're about the great and terrible day of the Lord, the judgment upon the earth, and many, many major themes you're going to find. The Leviathan, the monster that in the book of Revelation is a dragon and stands for Satan, the devil, and so forth. That's in these texts. The people of God being hidden and protected and sealed from danger. That's in these texts. The wonderful marriage feast or banquet at the end, celebrating the victory of God. That's in this section of Isaiah. So if you're not familiar with that section, get out a Bible, as Herbert Armstrong used to say. I quoted him last time. Blow the dust off your Bible and read Isaiah 24 through 27. Mark it up. Look at it if you want to understand what these Bible prophecies mean today to people that are applying them to our own time. Now, I've suggested throughout the series that a better way to take these prophecies is to see them in their historical, sometimes we say critical, I mean by critical, careful context in terms of when they were written and what they might first be referring to. That does not preclude a later meaning that people could properly derive and believe is still for the future. But read Isaiah 24 through 27. Okay, the four kingdoms of Daniel, very important, because the fourth kingdom is the setting up of the kingdom. It's practically quoted in the book of Revelation. Remember when the seventh seal is open and the seventh trumpet blows, the kingdoms of the world have become the kingdoms of the eternal God. And then the four beasts of Daniel, again, the four kingdoms, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And this idea that Rome would be revived through the ages with 7 heads and 10 horns. And then the little horn of Daniel 7. This is all through the book of Revelation. So you can go back and listen to those videos or watch them. The idea of a final evil ruler and a great tribulation that's going to come upon God's people, worse ever than any in history. That's all the way through the book of Revelation, where this terrible time of trouble is coming. Regathering of the 12 tribes. This is Ezekiel 37. It's also in the book of Revelation, where the 12 tribes are sealed and protected, and they're brought back as God's people. The final war of Gog, I called it here Gog and Magog. It's actually Gog in the land of Magog. That would be Ezekiel 38. Then the final battle for Jerusalem. I put Zechariah 14. You could put Joel 3. You could put a number of other texts there. And then the synoptic apocalypse, Mark 13, and then the book of Revelation. Now, I'm still going to do some other New Testament texts as I wind this series up. I want to do a bit of the Apostle Paul because that's the main thing I work on. But the book of Revelation, prophecy begins and ends with the book of Revelation. In fact, when you have these 3 angels with their messages, remember one of the messages is that in the days of this 7th angel, all the mysteries of God are going to be fulfilled that he revealed to the prophets. And if any of you are taking my Dead Sea Scrolls course, I'll put the link in the description here. You know that they also talk about this in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they talk about this being the final time and that their teacher has interpreted all the prophecies of their time, and they indeed applied it to the time of the Roman period. particularly the first century BCE when the Romans first came in. Okay? Now, what is the master prophetic scenario? And here I'm talking about how it's being mostly appropriated today by Bible prophecy-oriented Christians. I'm not covering all the views today. I'm trying to put it all together the way the book of Revelation is generally applied today. So this would be the futurist view, the view that most of the book of Revelation is yet to come, particularly if you begin with the opening of the seven seals. So remember, when you open the seals, you have the four horsemen. These are general signs of wars, earthquakes, famines, and pestilence. And then you have the sign, Daniel 11:36 through 12:4. You can look that up. And Jesus, when he's talking about this, he's literally interpreting Daniel 11 and 12. And if you look at Mark 13, about halfway through, after covering the general signs, he says, the end is not yet. The end is not yet. There's going to be even persecution and a terrible time of trouble. But the sign is the sign spoken of by the prophet Daniel. Now, in Mark, he doesn't even tell you what prophet. Maybe Mark's trying to kind of keep this undercover depending on when it's written. Because after all, Mark is written around the time, either shortly before, during, or after the Roman War. And do you really want to be talking about the sign of the end when the Romans are going to get utterly crushed, according to the prophecies? But before that, as part of the sign, you have this desolating sacrilege. And it's described in a number of places in the book of Revelation, as well as this trampling of the courts of Jerusalem, this final evil ruler who comes and invades the Holy Land in Jerusalem, demands worship, defiles Jerusalem and the holy place. According to Paul, I'll just jump into Paul here, 2 Thessalonians, at least written by Paul's followers, he says that this man of sin, he calls him, will sit in the temple of God and claim that he is God. Now, I think Paul was expecting that, or the Pauline school that wrote 2 Thessalonians, and they even say that the end can't come until that happens. But it obviously didn't happen in the first century. I think people were expecting it. And Mark 13, certainly if people read that, they would think that that's going to be it, because then immediately after that, you have the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven and so forth. But there's a time of trouble right after that, and then the deliverance and resurrection of the dead and the gathering of the saints and so forth. Now, I know some of my viewers who call themselves full preterists would listen to this and say, yep, Dr. Tabor, it all happened. But today, in this particular video, I'm talking about the mainstream prophetic scenarios that have taken over the airwaves, especially with the war going on. And they are expecting these things to unfold right now. After all, wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, famines, disease epidemics, and Jerusalem becomes contested, and there's this final battle, as we've covered. Now, when? Well, you're also going to find this idea of a 6,000-year pattern. Now, this has nothing to do with the young earth or anything like that. But if you go back to the chronology, I've got my Scofield Bible here, the old Scofield Bible, and I open it up, and it's got dates at the top, and I open up Genesis, and it says 404 BC. Now, very few people today think the creation of the world was in 404 BC. There are a few people that do, and I'm not going to really get into that right now. So if you begin with Adam and Eve and just sort of count the chronology, you come on down to our general period and you get 6,000 years. And this is one of the arguments that people make, that the millennial reign of the Messiah will come for 1,000 years as this previous scenario, let me go back, begins to unfold. And then you're going to have the millennial reign. We've talked a lot about this 70 weeks prophecy. Well, it should only be 490 years. But some interpreters have pointed out, even recently, that if you take this not as 490 years, but 70 jubilees of years, that is, a jubilee is 49 years, and you work it from the time that Israel entered the land, and usually that works out in this chronology to around 1400 BCE. I think exactly it might be 1406 or 7 BCE is the standard chronology of many evangelical Christians that go with the 1446 Exodus. And, it doesn't matter what you think of this. If you're going, oh my God, who could believe something like that? Well, millions of people actually believe this. But you see, in their argument, that would then lead to the year 2023, believe it or not. I'm seeing it all over the internet now, where people are saying, well, if you take 70 times 49, then you're going to get a longer period, because Daniel 9, where you have this prophecy, is not just about the time of Daniel and the Babylonian captivity, but it stretches all the way. And if you look at the things that are named in the book of Daniel, to seal up transgression, to make an end of sin, to fulfill all prophecy, then you would have to go all the way to the end. So there's a tremendous amount of excitement right now that the 70th Jubilee ended in 2023, just a few days before the Hamas attack on Israel. So this kind of thing can really get stirred up. The Jubilees are marked by Yom Kippur, and the attack came just the day after Sukkot, on Simchat Torah, on that Shabbat. So if you begin with the return of the Jews from Babylon, it's only going to stretch into the 1st century AD or CE. So you can see, so the two apocalyptic groups we know the most about from the 1st century CE would be the Dead Sea Scroll group and the Jesus followers. And they clearly are looking to something to do with Rome in their own time. And as I mentioned last time, 666, the number of the beast, which works out to Nero, written in Hebrew, Nero, Neron Kaser, or 616, which some manuscripts read because they leave off the final N, not Neron Kaser, but Nero Kaser. This has to do with the different vowels, and the letter Nun or N in Hebrews 50, so you would take off 50. But 666 fits Nero, and certainly, remember, the Dead Sea Scroll group goes all the way down to the time of the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. So even though they had earlier interpretations, and in the Habakkuk Pesher, I cover this in my Dead Sea Scroll course in great detail, they decide that all the times have expanded, and now it's up to God as to when to bring it, but they don't give up on their prophecies. Now, how could you possibly stretch it into the 20th century or even the 21st century? Well, the way you do that is by, first of all, beginning to think the time is at hand. So anywhere from the 1800s, the 1900s, the 20th century, you can begin to talk about the 6,000 year period being up. I think Usher's date works out to something like 1996. But beginning in the 1800s, Christians who are into prophecy belief begin to kind of blow the trumpet saying the time is at hand. William Miller is the best known. We've already talked about him. The pastor Charles Russell, but he starts the Bible student movement, and he was a Zionist, and he says that the Jews will return to the land of Israel. He's very important. Already talked about John Darby in the 1830s and dispensationalism. And what dispensationalism allowed prophetic interpreters to do was to stop the prophetic clock 7 years before the end, the final week of the 70 weeks prophecy. And then if Jerusalem means Jerusalem and the Jews return to the land and the clock has stopped, then everything can be read literally again. Now, here's my Scofield Bible again that I keep to remind me of the monumental influence of this book. It's unbelievable. It came out in 1909, but in 1917, when the second edition was brought out, why? Because General Allenby, the British general, drove the Ottoman Turks out of Jerusalem. And for the first time, Jews were allowed to go back and go to the Western Wall. And it was Hanukkah. And they kept Hanukkah during the month of Kislev, which is the month we're in right now when I'm making this video. And there's a prophecy in the book of Haggai that from this day forward, I will bless you. And it refers to the end times. So people are reading these prophecies and applying them to the time of the end. So 1917 was a really big year. And this second edition of the Scofield Bible came out. And I'm telling you, C.I. Scofield was the editor of the Bible, and he's building upon Darby's dispensationalism. So now all the prophecies of the Bible can come back together and be taken rather literally again after almost 2,000 years. And if you go back to the Dead Sea Scroll group, it would be over 2,000 years. And then the Jesus movement and the time of Nero, and then Vespasian, and then Domitian, and all of those persecutors of the Christians that would fit the scenario of the book of Revelation. You move all of that then to the future. End time prophecies must be read literally. So land of Israel means land of Israel. Tribes of Israel means tribes of Israel. It means the Jews coming back, and for some interpreters, the lost tribes coming back as well. So everybody's not ready for that to happen yet, but the clock is ticking, and it hasn't started yet until you see the desolating sacrilege standing in the temple. Well, there is no Jewish temple today. So that raises the alarm of what's going to finally happen in the Middle East. So here's my favorite picture of Jerusalem in terms of these prophecies, because you really get the sense of the old city. You can see the walls of the old city are going all around, but this Temple Mount compound that Herod the Great built, and what the Muslims call the Haram, and then the Dome of the Rock that's over the sacred rock that Christians, Jews, and Muslims believe that Abraham came to, Mount Moriah, the holy mountain, and then the Alaska Mosque right here to the south of it. So you're on the south looking to the north. Here's the Mount of Olives over here. And you're reading these prophecies about the Mount of Olives, about armies coming down from the north, and people are taking these things very literally again. And so Jerusalem does, in fact, mean Jerusalem. So let's look at the final slide and put this together for you here. Zionism, the return of the Jews to the Holy Land beginning in the 1880s. Now, Jews have been in the Holy Land throughout the centuries. Very few people realize that in the Ottoman census of 1900, before Allenby drove the Ottoman Turks out of Jerusalem, and it became part of the British Mandate of Palestine, it was called. And Palestine referred to the Holy Land, not an indigenous people, but the land of Palestine, which had been named Palestine by the Emperor Hadrian in 135 CE. So from the 1800s on, you get this return of many Jews from Europe to the Holy Land. But all through history, Jews have been in the Holy Land. So in the census of 1900, under the Ottoman Turks, there were more Jews in the old city right here. In the old city of Jerusalem, there are four quarters. This is the Jewish quarter, the Armenian quarter, the Christian quarter over to the left, and the Muslim quarter. So the Jewish population was the majority population up until the 1940s, when the Jordanians in 1948 expelled all the Jews from Jerusalem. So when people talk today about give the holy city of Jerusalem back to the Muslims, they're not being very accurate in terms of historical chronology. All three religions have had a presence there from antiquity, the Armenians being the oldest Christian group, the Muslims since the invasion in the 7th century of the Holy Land by the Muslims, but the Jews going back to at least 1000 BC in the time of King David. And that's not disputed even in the Quran. If you read the Quran, it's just become a political football today. So let me go back again. The establishment of the Jewish state, 1948, and then Jerusalem restored to Jewish rule or control in 1967. That is what really got people excited. These Christians that are dispensationalists, Schofield could have never dreamed of such a thing, but he kind of imagined it, that someday this would happen, that the old city of Jerusalem would be once again under Jewish control. The rise of Christian Zionism, which is kind of an odd thing because Christians believe that Jews are not part of the covenant. They've been broken off, according to the Apostle Paul. But Christian Zionists still want the Jews to come back. I know many of them. I think they genuinely love the Jewish people, but they believe they need to accept Christ, and they think they will accept Christ once these prophecies begin to be fulfilled. Now, here's something new. And I say new because no one in the early church held this view. This Darby and his followers began to popularize it. The rapture of the church, you're going to see that next time when I do John Hagee's, I think it's 8-minute synopsis of the end of the age. He says that Christ could come anytime. All of these things right here that are supposed to happen in the last 7 years, according to the Christian dispensationalist, which is by far the majority view of evangelical Christian interpretations of Bible prophecy, that this is going to all happen after the church is taken away to heaven. So the church is taken away to heaven, and that could happen anytime. That could happen before I finish recording this video. And then these things would break loose. The Antichrist would come. You'd have another person, not Nero, but a kind of Nero-like character. He would also have the number 666. He would put a mark on people. Jerusalem would be occupied, a terrible time of tribulation, and then the Christians say the return of Christ. So that's my last slide. So let me tell you what I want to do next. In the next video, I'm going to take an interpreter, John Hagee, probably the most prominent interpreter of this futurist dispensationalist view. I don't know if he carries a Schofield Bible or not, but he certainly knows what it is. And I think it's 8 minutes or so. I've clipped it out, and I want us to watch it, and I will then interrupt it and make comments along the way and deconstruct it and lay it out for you in what I hope will be a helpful way. Now, let me remind you, in this whole series, I'm trying to deal with interpretations that people have or have had or do still have, or maybe even will have in the future, because there are always adjustments to make when the end doesn't come. And yet I still see in the comments on all of these YouTube videos, and particularly the one I did last time, number 21 on the book of Revelation, oh, but Dr. Tabor, you missed this and you missed that, and this actually means this and this means the other. Further interpretations. I'm trying to give a general survey here, so bear with me. And I haven't done too much on contemporary Jewish views of some of these texts because they're not going to use the book of Revelation. And yet there are some prophetic scenarios we can talk about. So I want to do that. And then I want to do something on the Apostle Paul, because I actually think he stands aside from this prophetic scenario. I think he's a Jerusalem is in heaven kind of guy, and we'll see if I'm right on that. So he's more of a replacement guy. I don't think Paul thought that the dispensationalist idea is valid at all. And yet he's the one that gets credited with the idea of the rapture. But his view of Israel is very, very different. So we got to do that. And then I'll try to wind it up a little bit with maybe some final summary. So let's see, this is 22, 3, 4, probably 25 altogether. And then we can cap it. We can always do more. As things happen in the world, I might come on anytime and talk about things, but I hope this will be a body of study for people to have. And I want to offer a course on this where you would actually go through and take a more solid course like I'm doing right now with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I also want to offer a course on the Apostle Paul, the 7 core letters of Paul, the early letters of Paul that most scholars think are the genuine letters of Paul, with the others being more secondary. So take care, everybody. I hope you learn a lot from this and dig into your Bible. You don't have to have a King James Schofield Bible to study the Bible. Read whatever Bible you have handy and download these notes that I've been giving you. And I hope you're going to gain a lot from this series.